The morning I agreed to cater my ex-wife's second wedding, I told myself it was just business. Food service, a clean invoice, and out the back door before the toast. I was wrong about the door, and I was wrong about a lot of other things too. My name is Adam Foster. I was 41, I owned a small catering company outside Charleston, and I had spent the 2 years since my divorce learning how to be fine in the specific exhausting way people mean when they say it through their teeth. Fine at work. Fine at my daughter's soccer games where Rachel and I nodded at each other like polite strangers who had once shared a mortgage. Fine alone in a house that was too quiet on the weekends she had our girl. Rachel had left me for a man named Grant. Older, richer, the kind of man who wore his success the way other people wear cologne, a little too much of it, and you smelled him before he arrived. I never hated him the way movies said I should. That was almost the worst part. He wasn't a villain. He was just a door Rachel had been quietly looking for, and one day she found the handle. So when her wedding planner called my company 3 months ago, she didn't know whose ex-husband she was hiring. She just knew my lemon herb chicken had a reputation, and my prices were fair. I almost said no. I should have said no. Every reasonable part of me lined up to say no. Then my daughter Lily, 10 years old and far too perceptive, looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Mom said you'd never do it." And something old and stubborn in me sat up and answered before my good sense could stop it. That's how I ended up standing in the service tent behind a vineyard estate on a warm Saturday in October, plating $400 worth of appetizers for the woman who used to fall asleep on my shoulder. The string lights were already glowing. The white chairs were lined up in rows on the lawn. Somewhere past the hedges, a quartet was tuning up, and guests were arriving in the kind of clothes people buy specifically to be seen in. I had a plan. Serve the food, stay invisible, let Rachel have her perfect day, and let me keep the last shred of my dignity intact. I was good at invisible by then. I had been practicing for 2 years. Then a man in a gray suit stepped into the service tent, looked around like he was making sure no one had followed him, and walked straight toward me. I recognized him vaguely. Grant's best man, someone I'd seen in a photo once. He was holding 2 glasses of champagne. He clearly had no intention of drinking, and his face had the tight, pale look of a person carrying something heavy he'd been told to put down. "You're Adam," he said. Not a question. I set down my plating knife. "I'm working. If this is about the seating, it's not about the seating." He glanced back at the tent flap, then lowered his voice until I had to lean in to catch it. "Look, I've gone back and forth on this for a week, but if I let this happen and say nothing, I won't be able to live with it." He pressed one of the champagne glasses into my hand like he needed his own hands free. "Before you serve a single plate out there, you need to hear this." And that was the moment the day I had so carefully planned stopped belonging to me. His name was Marcus. I got that much before he said anything else that mattered. Grant's college roommate, his business partner for a while, the man who was supposed to stand beside him in an hour and tell 400 people what a good man the groom was. He didn't look like a man about to give that speech. He looked like a man who had read the speech, and every word of it had turned to ash in his mouth. "I need you to understand something first," Marcus said. "I'm not here because I have a problem with you. I don't even know you. I'm here because of the little girl." My whole body went cold. "Lily? Rachel's daughter. Your daughter." He nodded once, like he was confirming a fact for himself. That's why I couldn't stay quiet. I set the champagne glass down on the prep table because my hand had started to feel unreliable. Around us, my 2 servers were moving trays, and the sound of them felt suddenly very far away, like I was hearing the kitchen from underwater. "Say what you came to say," I told him. Marcus took a breath. "Grant is not who Rachel thinks he is, and I don't mean that in the vague way people say it. I mean there are specifics, there are documents, and in about a month, when the ink is dry on this marriage, some of those specifics are going to become her problem, and by extension, the kids." "What documents?" He glanced at the tent flap again. "Grant's business isn't doing what he says it's doing. He's leveraged everything. The house he told her he owns outright, there are 2 liens on it. The investment accounts he showed her, the ones that made her feel safe about quitting her job, half of them are borrowed against. He's not marrying her because he's stable, Adam. He's marrying her because she's the most stable thing left in his life, and he needs the picture of a family to keep the people he owes money to calm." I stared at him. I wanted to tell him he was lying, that this was some best man cold feet, some jealous thing I didn't understand. But Marcus didn't have the face of a man enjoying this. He had the face of a man doing the hardest thing he'd done in years. "Why are you telling me?" I asked. "Why not tell her?" I tried. His jaw tightened. 3 weeks ago, I sat her down and I told her she should look at the paperwork before the wedding, that she should protect herself, protect Lily, at least talk to a lawyer about keeping her assets separate. You know what happened? What? Grant found out I'd talked to her, and he sat me down and reminded me of every favor he'd ever done me, every check he'd floated when my restaurant was failing, and he said if I ever spoke to Rachel about his finances again, he'd call in all of it at once. He'd ruin me. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it at all. So I made a decision. I'd stand up there today, I'd give the speech, I'd keep my mouth shut, and I'd hate myself quietly for the rest of my life. That was the plan. Right up until I walked in here 20 minutes ago and saw the little girl in her flower dress practicing throwing petals on the lawn. He looked at me directly then, and his voice dropped even lower. I don't care what happens to Grant, but I couldn't watch that kid get folded into this without one person in this whole circus trying to stop it. And the only person here who loves her more than the party is you. The tent was quiet. Out on the lawn, the quartet finished tuning and slid into something soft and expensive. Somewhere in a dressing room in that beautiful estate, Rachel was putting on a dress and believing in a future that a stranger had just told me was built on sand. I have spent a lot of time since that day thinking about the man I was in that moment. 2 years of practicing invisible. 2 years of nodding politely at the man who took my wife. 2 years of telling myself that the mature thing, the dignified thing, was to stay out of it and let Rachel live the life she chose. And here was the truth I had to face standing in that service tent, with a plating knife next to my hand and a stranger's warning in my ears. Staying out of it was not the dignified thing, it was the easy thing, and I had been mistaking one for the other for a very long time. Do you have proof? I asked, not your word. Not a feeling, something I could actually show her that she couldn't wave away. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his gray suit and pulled out a folded envelope, thick, worn soft at the creases like it had been carried around for days. I made copies, he said. Loan documents. The liens. An email chain between Grant and his accountant that would make your stomach turn. I was going to burn it. I brought it today because part of me hoped I'd meet someone who'd give me a reason not to. He held it out. I didn't take it right away. Because I understood, the way you understand a thing in your body before your mind catches up, that the second I took that envelope, my quiet, invisible, fine little life was over. I would not be able to plate the chicken and slip out the back door. I would become part of this. I would have to look Rachel in the eye and detonate her perfect day. And there was no version of that where I came out looking like anything but a bitter ex-husband trying to blow up her happiness. Marcus saw the hesitation. I know what I'm asking, he said quietly. I know how it'll look. She'll think you did it out of jealousy. Everyone will. You'll be the villain in the story for a long time before anyone realizes you weren't. Then why should I take it? He looked past me, out toward the lawn where a small girl in a pale green dress was spinning in a slow circle with a basket of rose petals, laughing at nothing, the way children do when the day is warm and the adults are busy. Because she can't read the documents, Marcus said. And you can. I took the envelope. I need to tell you about Rachel before I tell you what I did next. Because otherwise you'll misunderstand the whole thing. People assume that when a marriage ends, the two people hate each other. Sometimes that's true. It wasn't for us, not really. And that made it harder, not easier. Rachel and I didn't fall apart in a fire. We fell apart in a slow drift, the kind where you look up one day and realize the shore is gone, and neither of you remembers rowing away from it. We married young. I was building the catering business from a single rented kitchen and a used van, working 18-hour days, coming home smelling like garlic and other people's celebrations. Rachel was patient about it for a long time, longer than I probably deserved. She held things together at home, she believed in what I was building, and when Lily came along, she poured herself into being a mother with the same fierce, quiet competence she did everything. But somewhere in those years, I stopped seeing her. Not on purpose. Just the way you stop seeing the paint on your own walls. I was so busy proving I could provide that I forgot the person I was providing for wanted to be looked at, not just kept. Grant looked at her. That's the ugly, simple heart of it. He came into her orbit at exactly the moment I had stopped, and he looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in any room, and after years of being the paint on the wall, she couldn't help but turn toward the light. I don't tell you this to excuse her. I tell you so you understand that when she left, I couldn't even build a clean hatred to keep me warm, because I knew my own fingerprints were on the crack she slipped through. So the anger I felt standing in that tent, it wasn't the jealous, wounded kind Marcus was afraid people would assume. It was something clearer than that. Rachel had made a choice to leave me, and that was hers to make. But she'd made it believing she was walking toward safety, toward a man who could give her and Lily the stable ground I'd been too distracted to offer. And now a stranger was telling me that ground was a trapdoor. She hadn't chosen a con man, she'd chosen a safe harbor, and someone had let her sail into a wreck. I put the envelope inside my chef's coat, against my chest, and I told my two servers to keep plating without me. Then I walked out of the service tent into the warm October light, past the white chairs and the string lights, toward the estate where the woman I used to love was getting ready to marry the wrong man. I got as far as the garden path before I stopped, because I realized I didn't have a plan. What was I going to do? Burst into the bridal suite waving papers like a lunatic? Corner her at the altar? Every version I imagined ended with security walking me to my van and Rachel more certain than ever that I was a bitter man trying to ruin her. I was standing there paralyzed when a small voice said, "Daddy?" Lily. She'd wandered off from wherever the flower girls were supposed to wait, her basket of petals swinging from one hand, her green dress a little crooked at the shoulder. "Hey, Bug," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I crouched down to fix her shoulder strap the way I'd done 1,000 times. "Why are you outside?" she asked. "Aren't you supposed to be with the food? Just getting some air. Why are you outside? Aren't you supposed to be throwing petals in a little while?" She scrunched up her face. "I'm nervous. Everybody's looking at everybody and being weird." She lowered her voice like she was sharing a secret. "Mom keeps crying, but she says they're happy tears. But she doesn't look happy. She looks like when she's about to give a big presentation. 10 years old and she'd read the whole room in one sentence." I looked at my daughter's face, and every abstract thing Marcus had told me in that tent turned concrete. The liens, the loans, the borrowed accounts, those were just words until I put them next to this specific child in this specific crooked dress. If Grant went down the way Marcus said he would, it wouldn't be an abstraction that got hurt. It would be her bedroom, her school, her sense that the ground under her feet would hold. "Lily," I said, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not think it's weird, okay?" "Okay. Go find Mom. Tell her, just Mom, not Grant, not anybody else. Tell her that Dad needs 2 minutes before the ceremony. In private. Tell her it's important and it's not about the food and it's not a fight." I held her small shoulders. "Can you remember all that?" She repeated it back to me almost word for word, because she was a smart kid who'd spent 2 years carrying careful messages between 2 houses. Then she looked at me with an expression too old for her face. "Is something wrong?" "I'm trying to make sure nothing is," I said. "Go on, quick and quiet." She went, green dress bouncing, and I stood in the garden with my heart slamming against the envelope in my coat. And I waited to find out whether the woman who'd left me would give her ex-husband 2 minutes on her wedding day. She came. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Rachel could have sent someone. She could have ignored a message from her ex delivered by their 10-year-old. She could have decided that whatever I wanted, it could wait until after she was married, or forever. Instead, 6 minutes later, she came around the hedge in a wedding dress with her veil pinned but not yet down, and her makeup already threatening under her eyes, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, not anger, not annoyance, just old, tired familiarity. The look of someone who knew me well enough to know I wouldn't pull her out of her own wedding for nothing. "Adam." She stopped a careful distance away, gathering her skirt in one hand. "Lily said it's important. If this is you trying to." "It's not," I said. "Whatever you think this is, it's not that. I'm not here to win you back. I'm not here to ruin your day for spite. I need you to believe that for the next 2 minutes, because what I'm about to show you is going to make you want to believe I'm lying." Something in my voice reached her. The bride softened, and for a second she was just Rachel, the woman who'd once been able to tell my moods from across a crowded room. "You're scaring me," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." I took the envelope out of my coat. "Grant's best man gave me this 20 minutes ago. Marcus. He tried to give it to you 3 weeks ago, and Grant threatened him into silence. He couldn't watch you and Lily walk into this without one person trying to warn you." I held it out, my hand not quite steady. "I didn't open it to hurt you, Rachel. I read it because you couldn't, and because if I put it back in my coat and served the chicken and said nothing, I'd never forgive myself." She didn't take it. She stared at it like it might bite. "What is it?" "It's Grant's finances. The real ones, not the ones he showed you." I made myself say it plainly, no cushioning, because cushioning would have felt like manipulation. "The house has 2 liens on it. The accounts that made you feel safe quitting your job, half of them are borrowed against. He's not marrying you from a place of stability. He's underwater, and he needs the picture of a wife and a family to keep the people he owes calm. Marcus has the loan documents, the liens, an email chain with Grant's accountant." I paused. "I know exactly how this sounds coming from me. That's why I brought the paper instead of just my word." For a long moment, Rachel didn't move. The quartet was playing on the other side of the hedge. Someone laughed, bright and unaware, 30 feet away. Then she took the envelope. Her hands were shaking. She opened it and she read, and I watched 2 years of certainty drain out of her face line by line. I want to be honest about what I felt watching her read, because it wasn't triumph. There's a version of this story where the wronged husband gets a bitter satisfaction from the moment his ex realizes she chose wrong. That wasn't in me. What I felt was grief. Because I could see her doing the math I'd already done. The job she'd quit, the apartment she'd given up, the way she'd merged her small, careful savings into his big, impressive nothing. I could see her landing on Lily, and I could see the exact second she believed it, because her hand went to her mouth, and a sound came out of her that I'd only heard once before, the night her father died. "Oh my God," she whispered. "The house closing is Monday." I signed. She stopped. Her eyes came up to mine, huge and terrified. "Adam, I signed things. He said they were routine." He said, "Okay." I stepped toward her, and every instinct I'd buried for 2 years came back at once, the instinct to steady her, to fix it. "Okay, listen to me. What you signed can probably be dealt with. Nothing's final until Monday, you just said so yourself. But you cannot marry him today. Do you understand? The marriage is the thing that ties his debt to your name. Everything else is fixable. That isn't. Everyone's out there." Her voice cracked. 400 people, his whole family, my mother. Lily's supposed to. She pressed the envelope to her chest. What do I even? You don't have to explain it to 400 people. You have to not sign a marriage license. That's the whole job today. Everything else can come later. She looked at me then, and I'll never forget it, because it was the first time in 2 years she'd looked at me like I was on her side. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "After everything. After what I did to you. Why aren't you letting me walk into it?" And there it was. The question the whole day had been building toward. The one I'd been asking myself since the moment Marcus put the envelope in my hand. I thought about lying. I thought about saying something noble and vague about being a decent person, but Rachel had always been able to tell when I was managing her, so I told her the truth. "Because I loved you for 12 years, I said. "That doesn't just turn off because you left. And because Lily is out there in a green dress, and whatever happened between you and me, she's ours. I'm not going to stand in a tent and plate appetizers while our daughter's future gets signed away by a man who's lying to her mother." I swallowed. "You chose to leave me. That was yours to choose, and I made my peace with it. But you didn't choose this. Somebody hid this from you. I wasn't going to be one more person who let you walk in blind." Rachel started to cry then, really cry, the kind that wrecks a carefully made-up face, and she didn't try to stop it. What happened over the next hour is a blur I've reassembled mostly from other people's accounts, because I wasn't fully in my body for it. Rachel didn't walk down the aisle. She asked Mai to find Marcus, and I did, and the three of us stood in a side room of that estate, while Marcus laid out everything he knew and Rachel confirmed it against the papers with a kind of terrible calm that comes after the first shock burns off. Grant realized something was wrong when the ceremony didn't start on time. He came looking, and he found the three of us in that room, and I watched his face do the thing that told me Marcus had been right about all of it. Because an innocent man, confronted with an accusation like that, gets confused. Grant didn't get confused. He got fast. He started calculating before he'd even heard the specifics. Who'd talked, what they had, how to spin it. He looked at the papers in Rachel's hand, and then he looked at Marcus, and something ugly and unsurprised settled over his face. "You," he said to Marcus very quietly. "Me," Marcus agreed. Then Grant turned the charm on Rachel, and it was honestly impressive to watch, in the way a controlled fire is impressive. The liens were a misunderstanding. The accounts were a temporary cash flow thing, normal for a man building something big. Marcus was jealous, had always been jealous, was trying to blow up Grant's happiness because his own life was a mess. And me? I was the bitter ex-husband, wasn't it obvious? Showing up to sabotage the wedding because I couldn't stand to see her happy. For about 30 seconds, I saw it working. I saw Rachel wanting to believe him, because believing him meant the day could still happen, meant she hadn't made a catastrophic mistake, meant the ground was solid after all. And then she looked down at the email chain in her hand, Grant's own words to his accountant, in black and white, and I watched her stop wanting to believe him. "Grant," she said, "read me this email, the one from June 4th, out loud. Read me the part where you tell David that once the wedding's done, her assets are on the table for the Henley loan." She held it out to him. "Read it and tell me it's a misunderstanding." He didn't read it. That was the answer. I won't pretend it was clean after that. It wasn't. There was a version of that afternoon where a man like Grant makes a scene, and he did for a while. The raised voice, the threats, the sudden pivot to wounded victim when the threats didn't land. Rachel's mother had to be told something. 400 people had to be sent home, and the story that reached them first was mostly the story Grant wanted told, the one where the bitter ex-husband ruined a beautiful day. Marcus lost a 15-year friendship in the space of an hour, and told me later he'd never slept better in his life. I gathered my servers, packed my van, and left 400 plates of untouched food behind, because it turned out I didn't have the stomach to invoice anyone. I drove home in the dark, not feeling like a hero, feeling wrung out and uncertain and half convinced I'd done a terrible thing wearing the mask of a good one. Lily fell asleep in the passenger seat before we hit the highway, still in her green dress, pedal basket empty on the floor between her feet. She'd never thrown a single one. The days right after were harder than the day itself, and nobody warns you about that. The day itself has adrenaline. The day itself has a clear task in front of you and no time to think. It's the week after, when the adrenaline drains out and there's nothing left but the wreckage and the phone calls, that a thing like this actually costs you. The story reached everyone before the truth did. That's how it always goes. By Monday, half of Charleston's catering and event world had heard some version of the afternoon a bitter ex-husband crashed a wedding and made a scene, and I got 2 cancellations that week from clients who'd booked me months earlier. One of them didn't even call, just an email, a few cold lines, no reason given. I didn't fight it. What was I going to say? Actually, I had noble reasons. Noble reasons don't fit in a subject line, and by the time anyone would have listened, the damage was already spreading somewhere else. My own mother called me, having heard it third hand, and asked in a careful voice whether I'd done something at Rachel's wedding. Not whether something had been done to Rachel, whether I had done something. And I understood, standing in my kitchen listening to my own mother's worry, exactly what Marcus had meant in the tent. You'll be the villain in the story for a long time before anyone realizes you weren't. He'd been trying to warn me, and I'd nodded like I understood, but you don't really understand a thing like that until it's your mother's voice on the line, gently asking if her son had become the kind of man who ruins weddings. I told her the truth, the short version. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Well, somebody had to." And that was the first moment since the garden path that I felt like maybe I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Marcus got it worse than I did. He'd lost a 15-year friendship, but more than that, he'd made an enemy of a man who knew where all his soft spots were. Grant spent the following weeks doing exactly what Marcus predicted he'd do, calling in favors, making sure the right people heard that Marcus was unstable, jealous, a liability. A supplier Marcus had worked with for a decade suddenly went cold. A small business loan he'd been counting on got quietly complicated. Grant couldn't touch Rachel anymore, not with the paperwork out in the open, so he spent his poison on the man who'd handed over the envelope. I asked Marcus once, weeks later, over beers in the half-renovated shell of his restaurant, whether he regretted it, whether if he could go back to that tent, he'd burn the papers like he'd originally planned and give the smiling best man speech and keep his friend and his supplier and his easy loan. He thought about it longer than I expected. That's how I knew his answer was real. "No," he said finally. "And I'll tell you why. Because the version of me that gives that speech, he doesn't get to be in the same room as the version of me that gives it. You understand? The day I handed you that envelope is the day I stopped being a guy who knew Grant was a liar and served the wine anyway. I'd trade a lot to keep that. Turns out I wouldn't trade that." He tipped his bottle toward me. "You'd know. You served the same wine at a lot of tables for 2 years, didn't you? Being fine. Being invisible. How'd that work out?" It landed, because it was true. I had. For 2 years I'd been the man who knew things and kept his hands still and his mouth shut and called it dignity. Marcus had cost himself a friendship and a supplier and a loan to stop being that man, and he was sitting in a wrecked restaurant, grinning like he'd gotten the better end of the deal. Because he had. Thought that was the end of it. A dramatic day, a disaster averted, and then the slow return to my quiet invisible life, except now with the added weight of being cast as the man who blew up Rachel's wedding. I figured she'd be grateful in some distant, complicated way, and that we'd go back to nodding at each other across soccer fields, except the nods would be even more loaded now. I was wrong about that too. 3 days after the wedding that wasn't, Rachel called. Not to coordinate Lily, just to talk. She'd spent the days since in lawyers' offices and on the phone with the bank, unwinding what she could, and she was raw and scared, but she was catching it in time, and she wanted me to know that. She wanted to say thank you in a way that a text couldn't hold. We talked for 2 hours. It was the longest real conversation we'd had in years, and somewhere in the middle of it I realized we were talking the way we used to before I turned into the paint on the wall. Easily, honestly, laughing at things and then getting quiet at things. When we hung up, I sat in my too-quiet house and felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time, which was the specific ache of missing a person who is still alive. I told myself it didn't mean anything. She'd just come out of one catastrophe. The last thing she needed was to fall backward into her ex-husband because he happened to be standing there when the ground opened up. I knew all about rebounds and gratitude wearing the mask of love. I'd read enough, watched enough, to be suspicious of exactly this. So I made a decision, and I stuck to it for a long time. I would be her friend. I would help her rebuild, and I would not make a single move that could be mistaken for me collecting a reward for good behavior. She noticed. Of course she did. Rachel had always been able to read me. It came up on a rainy evening about 2 months later. I'd come by her new place. A small rented townhouse, nothing like the estate she'd almost married into, but hers with her name on the lease and no liens on anything. Lily was asleep upstairs. Rachel and I were doing dishes, and it had become a normal thing by then, these ordinary evenings, and I'd stopped questioning why I kept finding reasons to stay for them. "You're doing the thing," she said, handing me a plate to dry. "What thing?" "The careful thing. You've been doing it for 2 months. You keep your hands very still around me." She said it lightly, but she wasn't looking at me, which is how I knew it wasn't light. "You show up, you fix my garbage disposal, you help with Lily's homework, and you keep a very specific distance, like there's a line painted on the floor and you're afraid to cross it." "There is a line," I said. "Why?" I set the plate down. "Because you just came out of something awful, and I was the one holding the ladder when you climbed out of it. And I don't want to be the thing you grab because your hands are still shaking. You deserve to choose the next thing standing on solid ground, not because I happened to be there on the worst day of your life." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she turned off the water and turned to face me, and her expression was the same one she'd worn, coming around that hedge in her wedding dress. Old, tired familiarity, the look of someone who knew me too well to let me get away with a noble evasion. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "It's not the wedding. It's not even the money, though God knows that keeps me up at night. It's the walk. Coming around that hedge. I was standing there in a dress that cost more than my car, about to marry a man who looked at me the way I always thought I wanted to be looked at. And then there you were on the garden path, terrified, holding an envelope, ready to blow up your whole quiet life to keep me from making a mistake." Her voice caught. "Grant looked at me like I was the most interesting thing in the room, Adam. You looked at me like I was worth protecting, even when it cost you everything and won you nothing. It took me 40 years and one canceled wedding to understand those aren't the same thing. And I spent so long chasing the first one that I almost missed that I'd already had the second one and thrown it away." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. "I'm not shaking anymore," she said. "It's been 2 months. I'm on solid ground. I have my own place, my own lawyer, my own name on my own lease, so you don't get to hide behind the rebound thing. Not anymore." She took a step toward me, closing some of the careful distance I'd been guarding. "I'm not choosing you because you saved me. I'm choosing you because when it mattered, you were the only person in a field of 400 who loved me enough to tell me the truth. I just need to know if the line on the floor is yours, or if it's mine to cross." I thought about all my careful reasons, all the ways this could be gratitude, or fear, or the pull of the familiar after a shock, and then I looked at her, really looked, the way I'd stopped doing years ago and had spent 2 years wishing I could go back and do differently. "It was never your line," I said. "It was mine, and I've been wanting to rub it out since the night I drove home from that wedding." "Then rub it out." I did. We didn't rush after that. We'd both learned what rushing costs. We went slowly, carefully, but a different kind of careful than before. Not the careful of a man afraid to want something, but the careful of two people who'd broken something once and intended to build the next thing right. Lily, who had spent 2 years carrying messages between 2 houses, watched her parents start eating dinner at the same table again, and had the good sense to say nothing about it beyond one quiet question to me, weeks in. "Are you and Mom being friends, or the other thing?" "The other thing," I told her, slowly. "Is that okay?" She considered it with the gravity of a small judge. "You didn't leave when Grant was being mean," she said finally. "You came and got Mom." Then she went back to her homework, and that, apparently, was her whole verdict. Marcus and I stayed friends. There's a strange bond that forms between two people who chose the hard right thing on the same day, and ours held. He rebuilt his restaurant, and I catered its reopening for free, and he stood up at the front of the room that night and told a story about a caterer who took an envelope when he could have plated the chicken and gone home. It got a bigger laugh and a wetter eye than any best man speech he'd ever planned to give. Grant faded out of the story the way men like that do, into other schemes, other cities, other people's cautionary tales. The bank sorted out what Rachel had signed. It wasn't painless, but it was survivable, which is the whole difference. She kept her name clean. She kept the ground under Lily's feet solid. That was the entire job, that October afternoon, and somehow we'd done it. A year and a half after the wedding that wasn't, I married Rachel in a backyard, my backyard, Our backyard by then, with about 30 people, folding chairs, and food I cooked myself because I wouldn't have trusted anyone else with it. Marcus was my best man. Lily threw the petals she'd been carrying in her basket for a year and a half, saved in a plastic bag in her closet like she'd known, somehow, that she'd get her chance to throw them at the right wedding eventually. She emptied the whole basket in one enthusiastic dump on my head halfway down the aisle, which was not how we'd rehearsed it, and it was perfect. There was no string light estate, no 400 guests, no man who looked at my wife like she was the most interesting thing in a room he was working. Just the woman I'd loved for 12 years, lost for 2, and found again on a garden path with an envelope in my hand, standing across from me on solid ground, choosing me with her eyes open. At the reception, someone asked how we got back together, and Rachel smiled the way she does now, the real way, and said, "He catered my first wedding." And I said, "It didn't happen." And she took my hand and said, "That was the whole point." Sometimes I think about the man I was in that service tent, plating appetizers, planning my quiet escape out the back door. 2 years of practicing invisible. 2 years of mistaking the easy thing for the dignified thing. If Marcus hadn't walked in, if I'd served the chicken and left before the toast the way I'd planned, I'd still be that man. Fine at soccer games, fine in a too quiet house, fine in the specific, exhausting way people mean when they say it through their teeth. The envelope changed all of that. But the envelope wasn't really the thing. The thing was the choice, standing on that garden path, knowing exactly how it would look, knowing I'd be the villain in the story for a long time before anyone understood I wasn't, and walking toward her anyway. The truth is, I went to that vineyard to cater my ex-wife's second wedding. What I actually did was refuse one last time to be the man who stood by and let the people he loved walk into the dark alone. And it turned out that was the man Rachel had been looking for all along. Not the one who looked at her like she was interesting. The one who looked at her like she was worth the cost. What would you have done if you'd been hired to cater your ex's wedding, and someone pulled you aside with the one truth that could stop it? Knowing that telling it would make you the villain and cost you everything, while saying nothing would keep your quiet, comfortable peace? And have you ever had a moment where the easy thing and the right thing stood in front of you wearing almost the same face, and you had to choose in a matter of seconds which one you were going to be? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.